It's ridiculous to believe that the core interface with AI will be text. And that's simply because like people hate reading, and the only thing people hate more than reading is writing. And those are basically your only two interaction modes that you currently have with AI, right? As models get smarter and as models get better, right? Like effectively the component of like how fast can you do this? How reliably can you do this? And at like what throughput can you do this actually becomes the bottleneck of the like total AI agent system. I personally do not know of a single time like a large Fortune 500 company has like switched their main operational ERP from like Oracle to SAP or the other way around because of that complexity. And I'm sure Accenture has been paid, hundreds of millions to try, right? Because this would be huge, right? But effectively, like you're locked into whichever provider you bought back in the 90s, and like the software is still the same as from the 90s because you can't change the software either, because then you'd have to change your people.
I'm just following curiosity here, basically. I'm not like, oh, I want to, I don't know, grow a big audience. So I explain the basics really well for like non-technical people. I just like, I want to have fun
Okay.
conversation. I want to have fun conversations.
Yeah.
That's it.
No,
So
no,
yeah,
no. I think that's also the right thing. I think that also draws people in, right? I feel like, yeah. There's so many people trying to do like weird explainers, and I feel like there's exactly one person who does these weird explainers incredibly well, and that's Matt Levine for like finance stuff, and like no one else does them at that quality, at that scale.
yeah.
And yeah, all the other ones are usually like I think they miss the audience, right? Because it's like, I was like, oh, let me explain GRPO easily, and I'm like, everyone who really cares about GRPO can take the tough explanation. They can read the
Yeah,
formula and they can understand what it means, right? I
yeah,
don't need that easy explanation.
yeah.
And then I think it's like really difficult to nail that audience. Uh-huh.
Although the work is did you watch the recent Ask Me Anything thing?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, so he said like we need Matt Levine for AI, but
Yeah,
yeah, maybe.
maybe someone, right? But I think it's also different, right? Because like the stuff that I personally believe the Matt Levine for AI to would write about most is also like all the company and company building shenanigans, because that's really the only thing that's public, right? Like you can write a lot about like OpenAI's fundraise or like what Anthropic did and whatever, right? To like compute deals. So it would feel a lot like Matt Levine, but content-wise, like what would that write about? Would it be like, oh, like this new paper looks interesting, like the one I read, but I wasn't supposed to read, the
Yeah.
simple RL Zoo one, which basically says like, yeah, any amount of SFT will like hurt ultimate accuracy of like your GRPO runs. And like, would that be the content? Like, what is the audience about this? Or would it be like the inside story on like, Studio Ghibli, right? I find it really difficult to imagine what kind of like the right granularity of content would be, right? And like and yeah, like the reason why Matt Levine also works is because because it's like regulated, a lot of the information actually becomes public, and he can do a lot of really great speculation with that info. But like we will never know like what will happen inside like what happened behind some launch, or like what fucked up, or like which huge training runs some team at OpenAI drove right into the wall, right? Like those would be the interesting stories, the stories we'd be compelled to tell, but
But I feel
there's
like
no
you could
real
get
outlet for
them.
them.
There's so much like information flow in San Francisco. Like an Anthropic employee and an OpenAI employee, they are like roommates and they like have a glass of beer and then suddenly whoops some
No,
information was leaked and
I just plant a bug at the site glass on 20th Street here in the Mission, and then basically I know the entire roadmap. But, would it just be like a rumor kind of a rumor mill? Maybe just
yeah.
gossip is the answer here. But yeah.
Yeah, it's surprisingly hard to learn things when there's not certainty in it. I feel like when I tried to learn what O1 was before DeepSeek R1 came out, and there was so many like speculations, like oh, I think it's like either like this or like this, and I read those papers or explainers, and I just never understood it because when my brain registered that okay, this is not certain, this is a speculation, then it went into some mode of like okay, just this is garbage, don't understand it. And then
Mhm.
the R1 paper came out, I read it once and I just like okay, now I understand this. But
Yeah.
before I read like 10 times more content, But since my brain was in this mode of like, this is speculation, I just like never learned anything. So
Okay.
maybe that would be, if
I,
it's
I
like gossip, then it's not.
I think that's the European brain talking. Like the American brain works the other way around. You hear gossip, you take up 100%. You hear the truth, and you're like, I'm not sure this is actually that interesting. I think like that might be your issue there.
Probably, probably. Yeah, I'm surprised how Americans, how confident they are in their statements that they know are not for sure. Like they tell it in a way where I listen, I'm like, whoa, this guy knows so much. And then in the end, it turns out like it was speculation and not really something that I should update my worldview on. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's something maybe
Um,
we should find a middle
I,
ground on.
I think it might be a downstream consequence of like Europeans are much more indefinite in their view of the future, right? Like they don't really know what the future will look like. Like it's a much more diffuse view. And I think like because you don't like have a definitive view of like what the future will actually look like, what you're effectively carrying around instead is like a probabilistic view of like, oh, lots of things could be true and like I keep updating my probabilities on this, but like I'm not actually gonna like, you know, be too strongly like on this like one vertical. Where I think like Americans are much more definitive in their view of the future. Like you'll talk to someone and they have no clue about anything, but they have an incredibly clear vision of what the world will look like in 10 years, which would sound like ludicrous to anyone from Europe, but like they are incredibly sure. And I actually think there's an insane value in that, right? Because like, yeah, you know, they might still be wrong. They most likely are in like 95% of cases, but like it's the 5% of cases that actually like end up making the world true that way.
Yeah, and you don't have that at all if you only have the probabilistic view. Then you get some like mediocre that is right in the mean, but like never super good predictions.
Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
on that topic? Like why did you move to the US? What value do you get in being here? You think?
I think that that's a good question. Like we somehow both made that move. I think like for me, like one of the big draws was like everyone who's thinking about this topic that I really care about and have cared about for a while, right? AI is like within, you know, 50 kilometers, 30 miles from here. And then everyone else basically always looks to here where you can go. I think it's just different. Like you down at a cafe here and you'll hear people discuss their AI takes, and most of them are bad, right? But like they're still AI takes. And like, what's the chance that you could sit down at a coffee shop in Zurich or in, you know, Stockholm and people would be talking about that, you know? And I think like that's the one thing, right? I think the other thing, like historically in tech waves, like when new technology breaks, like there was incredible value in like concentrating that around like one geo. And like if this is true again in AI, right, this is the geo you want to be in, right? I think like late stage technology you can create from anywhere. Like in the 2017 era, like let's wrap Postgres and like create some SaaS, you could probably do that effectively from anywhere. And there might actually be a good arbitrage to do it from somewhere that is not the Bay. But like if new technology breaks, you really want to be where like everyone who's working on that new technology works, right? And then yeah. Uh,
But like one thing I struggle with though is that I can't articulate to people why I need to be here. People ask like why did you move? Like why is it so much better to be there? And it's like
because
yeah,
everything else is worse, right?
but like I say the things that you just said. And then they ask me like, okay, but how often you just sit in and code all the time? Like how often do you actually go to these cafes? I was like, yeah, I went to a cafe like twice in the last 6 months, and both times I heard AI stuff. But like, okay, but like two times. Like it's incredible
and,
that
and you
100%
don't
of the times you hear AI stuff, but if you only do it two times, like what is the value really?
and you don't interact with the people, right? So you're just sitting there and you're like, oh yeah, they're also thinking about this. Um, and like I'll actually go to a cafe more often, but I'll bring my booklet and I'll be like, you know, the cluster's running, I'm thinking about like what experiments do I want to run next, right? So effectively you're just there and then like bouncing back to your desk again just to do some more. Um, and um, yeah, I think that's probably true. Like, I don't actually think like you overly interact with that many people, but like the quality of the people that you interact with is like on average decently high. And I think you'd probably like if you just off the top of your head counted the conversations, you'd probably undercount them quite a bit, right? And my guess is that like you actually do end up like seeing and talking to many more people than you would expect, right? And like I think that just like grows ideas. But yeah, I think it's very difficult, right? Because like we come from, a lot of people would say it's the same country, but we come from two different countries.
Sweden and Switzerland. It's not
Sweden
there.
and Switzerland with some of the highest standard of living in the world, right? Beautiful nature all around, like the streets are pristine, right? And then we move to San Francisco, right? None of these things hold, right? The weather is arguably nicer, right? But like that's basically where advantages end, right? And everything else is worse. And yet somehow like we're still kind of drawn to this place. And like when I first came here, I was sure I was gonna move away. Like I was like, oh, like I'm gonna be here for 5 to 10 years, and then I'm like gonna go back. But like every like additional day that I spent here, I feel like, will this be true? I don't know. Huh? Uh-huh.
Yeah, the weather is not arguably like it's
It's
definitely better. At least for Sweden. I don't know. Zurich is better than Stockholm, but
Zurich, yeah, Zurich, I don't think is as bad, but yeah, still not great.
right. Yeah, maybe this was a long. Like I
Hello.
should have done the intro like 10 minutes ago, but never. It's
I'm
better
lucky
late
that
than
you're
never.
also the editor.
Yeah. I don't, so yeah, I'm super happy to have Max here for the pod because I wrote a blog post a couple of weeks ago, and it was about like AI verticals and how I think basically the TLDR is like horizontal solutions will take over and can do everything that the AI verticals can do. But then when I wrote this, a lot of people said like, what about non-public data? Like how sure you can make a really good horizontal agent like operator or computer use from Anthropic, but like it doesn't have my specific data, and for this I need an AI vertical. And then my response is like, this will be autonomous. If you as a human can get them, then they will as well. But then that like highlights how important that aspect of retrieval is, like the fact that they like this all is on a knife edge where if they don't do retrieval well, then all of those critics are right. So I'm super happy to have Max here because like I don't think I know anyone who knows more about retrieval than Max. Max is the founder of Sid AI, which is basically a RAG as a service at the moment or something like that. You should explain it better. I think it's maybe my first question then. Like, welcome Max, and then what is Sid?
Yeah, I think like, our goal is to basically offer the best retrieval that's possible. And for a long time, we were integrators of other people's components to do that really well, and to do that like in a specialized way for all of your like data sources that you care about. But now we're effectively training our own models because like sadly the status quo has just like stagnated, not just on the retrieval models, but also on the like entire infrastructure side around it. Yeah, interesting times. It's fun. So, like, what is your concrete question on context retrieval and like all of these kinds of components?
Well, basically, so if it's like it's true that AI will need to get information from elsewhere, right? And then I imagine a future where you have like an operator plus plus. They're just like autonomously. They live on your computer and they can do bash commands and they can like search your files and all of this. And then why wouldn't or like what kind of retrieval systems are needed to get that future basically?
Yeah. Okay. So like to the first point, yes. Like without this, like probably impact of like any sort of intelligence that we can create and like some model weight will probably be not that impactful if you measure it in like what does this do to like GDP growth or what does this do to like the economy as a whole? Like maybe like the human equivalent here would be that some of the smartest humans on the planet, are locked away in some theoretical physics institute in the middle of nowhere in Canada, right? And you have incredible intelligence bundled in like one spot, but probably the at large impact, as long as they're not discovering anything like crazy and new, is probably pretty limited, right? And like economic impact happens when you can somehow apply intelligence to like a real world problem. And most of those real world problems aren't actually that well characterized on the internet, right? I think like software, like in Silicon Valley here, like software is incredibly well characterized on the internet. Like basically everything that you need to build a great software business, you can read online. But for a lot of other companies, right, that is not true. Like if you're a chemicals engineering company, like, hey, your research on like what leads to cracking under which temperatures, under which kind of stuff, like there's no information that's
You can't
reliable
get
on
that from
any of that.
Wikipedia?
No.
Okay.
No, yeah, we built this app for one of our customers. They're like a conglomerate. They're a group of chemical engineering companies like Chevron, Exxon, and they basically share research. And we did effectively like retrieval over that shared research. And the like base model quality that you'll get out of a GPT-4o is like dangerously inaccurate, right? And of course, you have no traceability to actually like know if it's making up those Kelvin figures or if they're actually the actual Kelvin numbers. And but yeah. So I think like that definitely holds true. Like without that information, right? And like it goes to like this intelligence kind of component, which conceivably over time could leak back into the models. But the other component is like just the transactional information of the day to day, where it's like, what are you working on last week? Like what is the priority right now for the company? Like what do you want to do, et cetera, et cetera. All these information is sitting somewhere. But it's natively inaccessible to just pure model weights. And your operator part, like I 100% believe that to be true, right? That effectively, like this will be the backstop to all of this, where it's like, okay, like if all other mechanisms fail, we can just like throw operator at this. And basically, it can iterate and like it can do this, and if it takes an hour to do it, that's fine. Like that's the ultimate backstop to some information that you need. But that's actually pretty slow, right? And if we believe that tokens per second and like just the total throughput of these systems just like grows vastly, which I personally believe to be true, then that quite quickly becomes a limiting factor. Like I think we chatted about this like in the context of like Amdahl's law, right? Where effectively like let's say, in a current system, like 50% of the operator time is just waiting for the system to load, right? To load that web page, to load that like record, to, that SAP, ERP, whatever like system you wanted to interact with. And like if we go and like currently it's like 50% the human does it, 50% like the system is just like loading. And if you now replace that human with an AI, right, that might be 1,000 times faster. The total speed up you can get out of that system is only 2x, which isn't actually like that much, right? Arguably, like 2x is pretty uninteresting from a pure product innovation perspective.
Where do you get 2x from?
This just like Amdahl's law, like the part that can't be sped up, right? The serial part, so to speak. And if you look at it like serial parallelizable, like that's your thing. The part that can't speed up ends up dominating the overall speed up performance. And so
Right.
effectively, this comes from like the time for the parallelizable part, or in this case, like the part that an AI agent can do, goes to zero. Right.
Yeah.
And the part that is just waiting is like the dominant factor. And if you scale that out, right, it's basically like 1 over the part that a human needs to do. Sorry, that basically, yeah, you need to wait for it. And if you want that overall system speed up to be much greater, like if you want AI agents to actually like do this, like what people are imagining, right, where effectively they can do a week's worth of work in a few minutes, right, then you need to give it tools to actually do that quickly, right? I don't actually believe you could operate like just like use a cloud VM instance and be fast enough to actually do a lot of these things that people want to do. And like as models get smarter and as models get better, right, like effectively the component of like how fast can you do this, how reliably can you do this, and at like what throughput can you do this actually becomes the bottleneck of the like total AI agent system. And I think like that's kind of like the other thing. And but yeah, like I think yeah, for us, right, like currently the best way to provide models context is like have people tell that to a model. The second best way is RAG, which is what we're currently working on. But essentially, like I don't really care about the technology that we use to solve the problem. What I really care about is that like we really, really focus on this problem of like, hey, how can we actually connect that intelligence that we have and that is growing, right? And that, the great people at all the labs, right, et cetera, are doing, are working so hard to do. And how can we actually connect that to like the real world where it'll have to take actions, where it'll have to use information, synthesize new information, like, and push that forward. And like that connector is, I think, like what I'm personally really interested in.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, because the interaction then between the operator and the environment, there's like two aspects to what takes time. Like today you have significant inference time on the AI side, but so then the slowness of the environment doesn't seem that severe, but the time of AI inference like drops dramatically at the moment and would probably continue to. And then at one point you will have inference speed that is like super quick, but then the environment that it interacts with is like super slow, and then it doesn't matter that all of these labs pour so much research money on making it quicker because the environment is still slow, and this is the problem you're trying
Yeah.
to solve essentially.
This is exactly the problem. And so if you actually like want these systems to do what people want them to do, right, which is effectively like, yeah, like, hey, can this do the work that currently a team does in, a week, a month, a year, right? And you wanted to do it incredibly quickly, you also have to work on those tools and you have to make them fast, right? And like, Cloud VM operator is the slowest way that you could conceivably do this, right? And the fastest is something like a, read-only copy of the data that is sitting somewhere. And that's like RAG on one end, right? And like different types of data will like require different solutions. And like, yeah, some systems will just never change or are so incredibly slow to change that most likely, will never actually, most likely will never, like operator will be the only way to interact with them for another like decade, 2 decade. And like I think like this leads into the next example where like, if I know you just recently had the pleasure of like entering your name on a vendor SAP system, and you're like,
Yes.
why does this still look like Windows 95?
This was not pleasurable. That's the wrong word for that. Jesus Christ! Like I've heard these horror stories of SAP. Like, oh, it's so bad software. How can it still be used? I was like, surely it's not that bad. Like, it's still. I think it's like Europe's biggest company at the moment. Surely it's not that bad. It was really bad. It was.
Yeah,
You had to put the same
maybe
information in.
Novo is bigger, but yeah, like something on that order. It's definitely still the largest European software company, right?
Yeah.
I don't. Uh-huh.
Actually, I think like as of a week ago, SAP overtook Novo, but maybe that went
Oh,
back or
okay.
something.
I'm
So
not
yeah,
keeping up with stock prices. But yeah, okay. So and like this seems absolutely crazy. Like, how can a software that is so obviously bad and flawed like still kind of rule the world? Um, and I think it's like but the issue is like once you have an ERP deployed across your organization, and once you have that software stack set up for a Fortune 500 company, um, it's almost impossible to change anything about it, right? Or to like replace it. And this is a few reasons, right? First, like most importantly, like the complexity of the software is actually quite big, right? Like I think like yeah, SAP's like smallest product has like something like 3,500 tables, right? And that's for like SMBs. At like the enterprise scale, like you're looking at just an incredible software complexity. But even if you can overcome that software complexity, for most likely, like if you're in a classical industry like manufacturing, like 20 to 30% of your time spent of your employees is basically just entering stuff into SAP systems and like getting it out of the SAP system and like moving it around, right? And because like yeah, like it basically tracks like, hey, who are we buying this screw from? Which product does this screw go into? Right? Who is going to place that screw into that product, and where is that product going to then be stored, right? And then delivered to whomever, right? This is an incredibly complex like flow. People are incredibly trained to do this, right? And like any change there would lead to major disruption, right? And so like if you were to yank out an ERP, right, and you'd have to retrain all of your employees, or you'd have to basically like change anything about it, most likely you're not doing anything for at least a few weeks. And for like and like I personally do not know of a single time like a large Fortune 500 company has like switched their main operational ERP from like Oracle to SAP or the other way around because of that complexity. And I'm sure Accenture has been paid, hundreds of millions to try, right? Because this would be huge, right? But effectively, like you're locked into whichever provider you bought back in the 90s, and like the software is still the same as from the 90s because you can't change the software either, because then you'd have to change your people. And so effectively, like, yeah, all of the downstream revenue that SAP has is most likely just discounted future maintenance on their existing systems. It's literally like mafia.
so I buy the argument that okay, it's complex, people are trained with it, but surely you can make like a clone that is clone like it's you don't have to switch the people because it's almost the same. But then if it's almost the same, then it's as bad. So that's not a good solution. But then you maybe like you gradually improve it. Like you
Yeah.
you sell it
So
with like you don't have to change because it's the same, but we have this and we will like we have a plan for gradually improving it until it's actually good and teaching people along the way.
So first, like I would argue, it's I'm not sure it's actually economical to try to replace the software feature by feature, right? Because essentially, like if you actually want to replace it feature by feature, you have to replicate every table, you have to replicate
Yeah,
every UI, right, et cetera, et cetera. And we talked about this before offline, but like for these early SAP like licensing kind of deals, right, or Oracle licensing deals for that matter, you would expect to pay X, the software license fee, just in systems integration, so just in customizing the software, right? Um,
what?
and so, like, yeah, if you bought your ERP for, let's say, 10 million, right, the license to use that back in the 90s, you would expect to immediately spend like 70 million on Accenture or like any of these others to actually not like configure the software for you, but actually change the source code of the software to adapt it to your business processes. And like back then, like Oracle really tried hard to basically say, like, why don't you, like, we talk to the world's best experts on how you should run your sales organization or how you should do your inventory management or any of these kinds of things. We've built these world best practices right into our software. So why don't you just like buy the software from us off the shelf and change your company to match the software? And like this did not work. This did not work. Like they had no success with this. And then they switched to the SAP model, which was basically okay, we have like this like raw software, which no one is going to actually use. And then we're going to, for every customer, spend 7x what they pay for the software to actually customize that software. So it matches what these companies were already doing in the past, right? And basically
But
just
why
like
didn't it
mirror the
work?
existing processes in the software.
So why didn't it work? Like it seems like a really good selling
Why the
point. You don't have
Oracle?
to pay. Yeah, why didn't the Oracle version work?
Because all the enterprises found it was harder to retrain their people to learn new processes, right? And like there's huge
Fair.
resistance there. Like I'm running like the sales org at like an enterprise, and now like someone wants to say, oh, like basically change all the processes that you're doing, and not just change the processes, like processes in enterprises are people, right? Where it's like, oh, like currently our sales has to go through this approval process, et cetera, right? And like if I change that process, I'm probably gonna have to like let people go. This is not just like I do the Notion checklist in a different order, right? This is like, yeah, there's people who are like designed around this process. There's like headcount. There's like all of this, right? And effectively, you'd have to like rejiggle the entire org, right? And then at the same time, like I think there's also just like huge differences between the requirements of businesses in different industries, right? I think like, also that's why most enterprises still don't buy their software like off the shelf, right? Because the businesses are just so different, right? And so like, SAP will go from like charging people full fare to like giving people 90% discounts just to kind of like make it work on their end, right? And it's like, yeah, like this is the same software and we're selling it like to like 10x different prices. And that is totally normal, right? Because like the way that a John Deere uses that software is different than a Roche uses that software, right? And maybe you need to price it accordingly. And yeah, like totally weird. Like in the end, like everything at enterprise level is custom, and it's like it's impossible to move between them because moving between them would always mean you have to change out your people. And just like the yeah, it's like so finely intertwined with the processes that like yeah. I think like still in 2060, if you were a new vendor at your guys' company, most likely you'd still be using that same ERP. I actually think it's easier to basically start a new pharma company on a new ERP than get Roche to change which ERP they're currently using. I think like that would probably be my take.
So
I
what
think
does
you
this mean for like AI companies? Like I now envision that okay, like the horizontal agents are going to be able to do everything that the verticals are going to do. So there will be no reason for anyone to have a vertical solution because they already have a ChatGPT subscription and that can do whatever your vertical is doing. But with that, it's with the story that you just told, it seems like it's not going to be enough to just have the horizontal agents, or what's your take there?
Yeah. Yes and no. I think like there's still just such an incredible amount of I think what you're effectively talking about, like this is this concept I call like record and replace, right? Where it's effective like I very much see a conceivable future where a large share of like intelligence work, by intelligence work I mean laptop work, where it's effective like your job can be all done from a laptop. And that effectively, like one way you could arbitrage that away is basically, oh, you record everyone's screen, right? And most likely, if I record you doing that task 3 or 4 times, right, and I have a model that generalizes pretty well, which LLMs do. That's why they're as big as they are today. And probably like I can use a future version of operator to basically like completely arb that away, right? Where like any task that you currently do basically just turns into a play button, right? Where it's like, oh, let me play that task for you, and then it gets done. And I think that's pretty accurate for actually a decent amount of like, especially like admin type of work and like this kind of direction and this kind of stuff. And my guess is that also like, right, for like, yeah, things where like the kinds of interactions you do are quite public, like social media, like managing the accounts, not writing the actual posts, like probably also that too, but like going in that direction where it's like, oh, this is quite well defined, like how you have to do stuff, etc., etc. But even that, like for a large enterprise, these processes are so incredibly complex, and mapping these out is, I would argue, like close to impossible, and that you would still want some customization on the actual models that actually end up performing that task, right? Because like a lot of this stuff is not logical, right? Like this is kind of the other thing. Like you could have an incredibly smart AI, right, and they will still use that SAP system wrong because the most logical way to use the ERP system definitely is not the way that it's supposed to be used. And like you somehow need to somehow like bridge that gap and like, hey, can we somehow get the models to understand like what that process actually looks like in real life, right? Like can we actually get them to understand the context that they need, right, and like learn from that, etc., right? um and so like I'm still skeptical of like the true general purpose kind of way there, but like in general I think like technology wise this will be possible, right? But there's still that like, hey, can we actually like connect that, right, to what people actually do today and what people need to be should do, and etc., like, and push that forward to actually like make them effective. Like maybe like one kind of yeah, like one of the beautiful things about humans is like they're usually quite awful at a task like day one, right? Like this is the kind of like the intern problem. And I think to some degree, like talking to ChatGPT still feels like talking to an intern. And like the intern gets progressively smarter, but it's like, yeah, okay, like it'll say stuff and you're like, no, this is obviously wrong, but you don't know why this is obviously wrong. I know why this is obviously wrong. But it's more like a function of them not knowing and not them not being able to process that information. And but humans are incredibly good. Like, set anyone on a task for a year, right? And like, they can probably do it incredibly well. And like they can build experience around that incredibly quickly, right? And we currently don't really have a mechanism to do that well, right? Because we kind of do want the models to remain stateless for, semi-obvious reasons, right? Because it's just nicer from an engineering abstraction. And yeah.
But
No.
maybe that won't be the case for that long. Like
Mm.
if you just like append all the history to its context window and let it run loose for without stopping, then it will learn from mistakes, right? And then maybe it will improve the way that humans do.
Yeah. So like, but in context is still stateless. Like this is still along the lines of like what
Oh,
I'm
okay.
trying to say. What I mean, like a non-stateless model would be one that where effectively like for each task, like for each instance of like it completing a task, it like iteratively improves and iteratively gets better. And I think like a lot of people have tried this, right? In theory, like this isn't that complex, but from an engineering perspective, this is awful, right? And I'm sure like with like better like RDMA, like, oh, can we load LoRa adapters in quickly? We could conceivably do like something like this, right? And people are definitely trying. But I feel like just from an engineering perspective, I'd be surprised if most of the models that people use are like stateless or are no longer stateless in the future. For like consumer grade applications, for enterprise applications, basically everything runs on a custom instance with a custom model or with a custom like weird kind of stuff, right? Because you can always like squeeze out extra performance by doing that way.
Oh, but is there really a distinction there? Because by adding things to the context window,
Yeah.
and then you have your KV cache, and this KV cache is stored for the future. This is effectively, since you're like attending to these tokens, this actually changes. It doesn't change the weights, but it changes like the activations for all future. Isn't this essentially this like not the same, but it's
Like you're trying to tell me like, oh, in context learning is still like learning and it works, right? Which like
yes,
obviously is
exactly.
true. Like,
Yeah,
yeah. But I would still, yeah, like I think maybe we're hung up on the definition of stateless here,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because like
Doesn't really matter.
to me, right, like even a cached, even a KV cache, right, or like a token cache or like a prompt prefix cache is not really like a stateless. I don't think that really breaks the stateless abstraction. I think it's just like an engineering optimization. But yeah, in context learning works, right? I think like that's why these models are as good as they are, right? Like if they couldn't learn in context, right? I think like that was pretty clear, like starting GPT-3, right? Like that you could basically get it to manipulate facts in context, right? And like basically like learn new things in context and then apply those like with some accuracy and like with increasing accuracy as time goes by.
I think it would be useful to. So we talk a lot about like how the future will how will different aspects of the future play out? But what do you actually think the future will look like in this scenario where we say that it's like this and this is going to be needed, these aspects still remain? How do you see the future? Like in 2 years, how like what will be the interface to ChatGPT? How will people, how enterprises, how will they interact with AI in your opinion or your prediction?
I think a few things here. First, like I think in 2 years, very little changes, right? I think like that's like the sad projection that like it's incredibly slow to actually like get change, especially if that change means like changing how people do things, right? I think like in the burden for a new interface has to be incredibly high, right? Just because like people are incredibly used to it. Like ChatGPT arguably worked because people already knew the chat interface from basically using WhatsApp and text messages for the last 20 years. And like they basically just like were able to graft onto that existing thing, right? And like software retention almost always is like, can you get the people to change their brains to match your software before they churn off, right? I think like that's usually like, can you, no, I mean, like, that's basically what it boils down to. Like, what is a good Notion customer? It's someone who's like changed the way that they think and structure nodes, et cetera, in Notion's way, right? Before they're like, oh, fuck this, right? And then, like, yeah, so I think like that's basically how all kinds of software works. I don't think that is how software has to work in the future, though, right? Because like currently changing software is incredibly expensive and you have to design software to work for a billion people because otherwise you can't really amortize the costs, right? Especially because like most software that people like really love, right, is actually quite expensive. I think like the incremental cost of software is like just going to zero, right, quite precipitously. And like I absolutely also like maybe a conversation for later. I personally believe that we'll get almost perfect code writing ability decently soon. To me, this is a pure engineering perspective, not an actually like scientific perspective, because we have verifiable environments, right, for code, which we don't have for like English writing or social media posts, because like the feedback times and the kinds of feedback that you can get are just like the reward signals aren't as good. Back to the interface, right? What you can now do with like AI-based interfaces is you can adapt the interface to the way that people actually already do things, right? In a sense, you can get like the enterprise. This wasn't how this thinking originated, but like essentially, like you could get what an enterprise could get in the 90s by paying Accenture $70 million to adjust the software just the way that you like it, right? But you can basically get it for free and individualized for everyone, right? And effectively, like whatever you do, whatever you end up doing, right? It's just like pure it's purely on the fly, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some things that you will not want to do on the fly. Like, loading an index over the entire internet, right, is not something that you want to do on the fly, right? That's something you need like proper infrastructure for. And there's like a few kinds of these problems where it's like, oh, like if the data volumes are really large or you want to do something really complicated, right, you need like actually hard engineering infrastructure to back that up, right? But the interaction to that could be like, MCP, right, in the like current kind of way, right, where effectively like, oh, the software stack is bifurcated into these like basically like API-based systems, right, that are basically just running and churning in the background that are really fast. Like as we talked about before, this is critically important if you want to deliver a system that like can work agentically, right? It's like, for example, one of the models that we're training is effectively a reasoning model over retrieval. And where previously for like one raw query, we would be doing like a single lookup in the vector database, right? We're now doing something like 30 lookups in the vector database, right? And this is a step change improvement in overall accuracy, which is what people care about most. But of course, like if we had to wait 10 seconds for each of these queries, right, that would be completely infeasible, right? Because now you'd be waiting 5 minutes every single time you ask a question, right? Which in a user-facing system is like untenable. And that actually really matters, like how fast can your tools be? Software will be just bifurcated between effectively like the user-facing component, which is incredibly fluid and incredibly dynamic, and then a more or less static system of like, hey, these databases and these database entries where it's like, oh, United has a database where I can book a flight through them, and then they'll send that back, right? But like how that actually appears on my end is completely custom and like customized to how I like things. And to me, like this is also like just from a pure like manifesto perspective, incredibly interesting, right? Because currently, right, because software is so expensive to develop and it has to be developed for a billion people, right? And my financial motives might not, and like my just motives in general might not match up with the makers of the software's motives, right? I think like that's basically what TikTok does. It's actually really difficult to it's actually impossible to control the software that controls your life, right? Like, you do not control it, right? You don't even have a semblance of control, right? And like whatever Apple gives you to customize your home screen, right? That's not control. And I think like not controlling the software that you use every day was like totally fine back in like the 90s, 2000s, when like 10% of your day was software, 20% of your day was software. Like for most kids today, like software is like 80% of their day, right? Like they basically like almost all their free time goes into software. Like, and then their non-free time is also software, right? So effectively like your entire interaction is like with software, and like having no control over the software that basically you dedicate your entire life to is crazy to me. And I believe it will be crazy in hindsight in like 20, 30 years when people like, wait, so you just like took off the shelf kind of stuff, right? I think it'll feel similarly how we currently feel about like Soviet living blocks, where like everyone, like huge blocks, everyone had exactly the same apartment, exactly the same furniture, like no customization, right? Or like dystopian future novels where it's like everyone has exactly the same, right? Everyone wears exactly the same stuff. Like that's how it'll feel to future people, where it's like, wait, what do you mean, right? Like you use the same thing as everyone else. That's a communist dystopia, right? And I think like so that's like personally that's where this like whole thing is going. I personally believe the current iterations to be quite uninspired, and like I have like a lot of ideas on how to like actually implement this.
What do you mean current iterations? What do you mean by that?
So if I just like project um if I project forward, like what are the people at Anthropic doing? What are the people at OpenAI doing? Right. And just like looking at like where is this kind of going? Like how are they thinking about product? How are they thinking about expanding product? Then if you just project out that line, even if it's an exponential line on improvement, right? I don't actually believe that to be that different. It's like from a usability perspective, like there's a lot of convenience features added. But essentially, the experience is still the same as in, December 2022, right? It improved vastly from like September 2022 because the OpenAI playground back then was awful. It
Yeah.
wasn't awful, right? But like it was basically like just one big like text box, right? And like with sliders on the side, and that was basically how you could interact with the model.
Yeah.
And ChatGPT was way better, better than that. But essentially since then, like it's just convenience features on top of that. And like one thing that I promise not to, I won't get into my co-founder that I won't get into too much detail on this because this is something that we were interested in building and launching. But effectively, to me, it's ridiculous to believe that the core interface with AI will be text. And that's simply because like people hate reading, and the only thing people hate more than reading is writing. And those are basically your only two interaction modes that you currently have with AI, right? And like voice isn't practical for a lot of like societal reasons, right? Like I don't think people are attuned yet to people like talking to their devices like in public, right? Especially in crowded public spaces. And it's also too slow, right? Like I realize this with it's like, yeah, like having that AI read the information back to me is just like too slow, right? And even if I could like 3x that, it's just like, yeah, it isn't concise enough in that sense, right? Because it isn't trained to be concise enough. And I also don't like out of that kind of like stuff, right? I don't really work. And like text allows me to scan stuff incredibly quickly and get that information. But of course, like text is still slow from like information gathering perspective. Like video, of course, is the best.
But it could be fast. Like yeah, they are not concise at the moment, but like surely if you add to the system prompt, please be concise, or maybe not like that. But couldn't it be faster? Like interacting with like a good colleague is super information dense and good. Couldn't that be the future? And also on
Actually,
the point
actually,
with
I actually
like
don't.
society. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
So I actually don't think interacting with a colleague is more information dense than most software interfaces that we have today. Um, so like Uh, I think the reason why talking to a colleague is effective is because like you can get fuzzy answers, right? In the sense where like my question might not be perfect, my answer might not be perfect, but like they're incredibly good at judging everything else from context, right? Whereas like at least in the current iteration, like so like I can like look at someone weird and then like say one syllable or like a huh, right? And they immediately like that conveys so much information to a human, right? And like just the situation of us being there, their history of what they know about me, right? The history of what they know about the stuff that they know about, right? Et cetera, like actually like makes that information density work, right? But in the current like assistance schema, like this doesn't work yet, right? Again, like a context kind of limitation. And then the other thing is like I actually believe like having a full screen is more information dense than I could get out of a colleague, right? Imagine you'd have to program, and the only way that you could program is like that person has their own screen which you can't see, and you just have to tell them what to do, and they talk to you back on like what they're currently doing and what's working and et cetera, et cetera. Like even if they were good and like pumping in those keystrokes, right? But you couldn't see them, like most
Yeah.
likely, like and then they'd have to describe to you what the output was. Like I actually think our software is pretty good at information density. Um,
So
uh-huh.
the alternative would be some kind of system where you have visual buttons and they mean stuff, and or what do you envision?
I'm unsure how deeply I want to get into this because
Okay,
we've actually been prototyping something, and I would hate to like take the
let's
coolest of the prototype. But I'm sure
let.
I'll send it to you as early as something's ready.
I'm excited for
But
that.
yeah, I think the answer is incredibly expensive today. But like, yeah, I think we talked about this frontier. Like if you pin intelligence at one level, right, that cost effectively like decreases 100x over a year,
Yeah,
right? And if like for ChatGPT 3.5, like to get that level of intelligence today is probably 10,000x cheaper than it was when it first came out. Just like looking at the API based pricing and effective like yeah, that's why definitely like, if you're thinking about products, it absolutely makes sense to think about products like where that can be in 2 years, right? And less so like, ooh, what is that today, right? I think like I read this, I don't know where I got this snippet from, but like there was this like nice excerpt about like Mark Andreessen like when he was like first thinking about like Netscape and like developing the browser and like how should HTML look and what should it support, right? Like in the early internet, apparently there was a bit debate about whether you should include like whether image tags should be supported, right? Like whether images should be available as part of HTML on the internet, right? And like at the beginning, people were like, no, like the bandwidth doesn't work, and like the computers that people are looking at this on, like are too bad anyways, right? Like they don't have the horsepower and like et cetera, et cetera. Um, and then basically, like, but Mark Andreessen was sitting in front of like a 50,000 or like in today's dollars, probably 200 grand, right? Computer at his like research institute, and he's like, my computer can obviously do this, right? And I have this huge bandwidth, and like I can load images, right, et cetera, et cetera. Like trivially, I believe this capability should like trickle down to everyone. And while it's expensive today and it's infeasible today, in a few years down the line, like totally, right? And that's like why he advocated for it. That's why I think like Netscape won or like the original version like supported it, right? Because he basically saw that future coming by just like being on the slightly too expensive today kind of edge, right? And I think like that's a huge arbitrage, right, today. And like people actually underestimate how much compute you could expend per person per user, right? Like reasonably like Facebook makes $1.20 per user hour, something on that order. My assumption is YouTube actually makes it a good amount more, but like Facebook makes $1.20 per user hour. And if I'm buying spot price H100s, that's pretty much the same amount, right? And so in theory, like if you can design a service to run on a single H100 like and serve one person, you can probably make that work financially, which is crazy. An H100 is actually an insane amount of compute that you can expend. And of course, like that's just like a mental model, right? Like the serving infrastructure for that would look very different, but like just from that perspective, right? And that actually gives you an incredible leeway to design these products and to think about like, hey, what can you do? And then yeah, just like with some certainty that you'll be able to monetize in the future.
I actually don't agree with you said that there's only be incremental improvements to the UI. Yeah, if you just look at the UI, but the fact that my usage of ChatGPT nowadays is often I ask a question and then I go away for 2 minutes and then I come back. That is very significant to like a very significant change. Like I have become really good at knowing which questions should I spend more time on, like which one should I go to OpenAI o1 Pro and wait 3 minutes on, and which ones should I go to deep research and wait 2 minutes on, and which ones do I just want a quick answer. I think this is
Yeah.
different UI wise. And I think when we get operator and stuff like this, operator is pretty bad now and it can't do, it's very restricted. But like when we get that, I don't think these are just incremental improvements. And
Yeah.
that's projection. If you like project that out,
So
I think it's very different from how people
I
interact with
guess
it.
it's so, but is this actually an improvement, right? Like in an ideal world, like you'd get rid of effectively forcing that thinking on you, right? Where it's like, oh, like I'll go to this, like I need a writing question, so I'll go to Claude because it writes well, right? And like, oh, like I just like want this deeply researched, so I'll go to like, oh, like to me, this is actually like a bug, not a feature, right? And ideally, I'd want any answer as quickly as I can get it, right? Like
Yeah,
if you could, for example, in deep research, like if the answers were instant, you'd probably use it much more, right? Which I think
sure.
is kind of like the right thing. I think like what has changed from a usability perspective and what I love deep research for is I'll just have it deep research like the most benign things, right? Like super small, like like the tiniest problems in my life now get the equivalent of like someone spending 2 hours 3 hours researching this. Like this is like also like how I see like this growing, right? Where it's effectively like just that intelligence, like you basically apply it. You could definitely apply it to the kind of things that we're currently applying it to, right? And that's always the first step. That's your record and replace. That's your like, hey, how can we take this task that a human currently does and have an AI do it? But in the second iteration, what will actually happen and what might happen sooner is effectively we start learning to apply intelligence to any problem whatsoever, right? And we start applying absurd amounts of intelligence to this. Like the smallest issue that you could come up with will have insane amounts of engineering spent on it and people pushing for it and basically working on it.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. You should probably project that compute is going down, and then it will be feasible to do that. So
Yeah, yeah.
that will probably be true. So in terms of okay, so this the consumer UI or like the consumer way of interacting with AI in 2 years won't be that different from now. How about
So yes and no, right? I think the
my summarization of your answer there was I thought that was okay, short
yeah,
summary,
yeah,
then move on. But okay,
yeah.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. Go ahead.
No, no. So like I think the current so like it's always difficult to expect. So I don't think the way that a majority of ChatGPT use will happen will be vastly different, right? But I can totally see like someone new growing at a much faster exponential rate than ChatGPT is growing in 2 years and become the de facto standard in four, right? I think like that's my prediction here, right? But there's actually quite a lot of inertia behind the way that ChatGPT is doing
Wait,
things.
like so another chat interface, but it's from someone
No,
else, or
a different kind of AI interface, right? And
okay,
my guess is that interface would be more limited in a lot of features, right?
yeah,
And like more annoying to use, but it would just have better attention and like excited.
yeah, okay, okay. So in terms of enterprises, how will they use AI in 2 years? Will it be a bunch? Will it essentially be a bunch of like consumers within the enterprises that uses AI this way, or will the structural way of using AI at enterprises change a lot?
Yeah. So I think a lot of like the a lot of the issue with AI at the enterprise is like, how do you account for the value that this ends up providing, right? And like for me, it's super easy to justify my personal expense for like ChatGPT and all these other tools because I know what they deliver, right? And like I somehow like have some sort of value of my time, right? And I can project that out. But at the enterprise level, like, you know, let's say, you know, Microsoft is pitching their Copilot to all of your employees for something between $20 and $40, right? You have 1,000 employees. That's actually quite a large expense over that entire organization. And it gives you absolutely no sort of way to measure what the kind of like downstream impact this has. And like what you'll hear is just like, you know, there was this like one BCG study where it's like, oh, this makes your people 40% more effective, like something on that order. And then you'll like on a C level, on a board level, right? The question comes like, okay, 40% more effective. Does that mean I can, you know, let people go? Does that mean like I should expect all of my numbers to go up by 40%, right? Like, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's incredibly difficult to actually measure the impact that this has, right? And like the current chat interfaces offer no way to actually do that well. And I think like that makes it really hard to adopt these kinds of things at scale, right, and have them grow, right? Effectively, like I think orgs should still do it, and orgs are still doing it, but like I would be very wary of this currently coming out of experimental budgets for them trying to find out like what people are using it for, and then effectively looking at ways to like automate that, right? Because like in the way you actually like want to do this is effectively you take a current process that is currently done by humans, you turn that into a process that you can do with AI, right? And then of course you can quantify those savings quite easily, right? And if you've built your business around effectively like trying to do that, right, I think you're going to have a much, much easier time actually selling this to large companies, right? Because if there's a dashboard that they can check where it's like, oh, this is the value that we're providing, and like this is how much we cost, right? As long as that delta is good, right? Most likely you can sell that quite easily. But if you really don't have that sort of like large scale measurement, right? It's really difficult to actually like convince them to do it. Like you'll have these really bizarre conversations where it's like the board member is using it personally, right? All the time. But at the same time, they cannot justify the expense for the entire organization, right? Which is like this complete like yeah, but yeah, like the enterprise does not make sense, right? That's like between every decision, there's like 6 layers of like other things, and like basically like yeah, logical is not the name of the game.
You once said that you think that Llama, or like in offline in conversation, you said that Llama 2 will probably be used in production still in 10 years at enterprises.
Yeah.
This I have struggled to believe in, but please
So
make the case.
So like I think this goes into the direction of like how often do enterprises like really like see a reason to change their systems, right? Like for example, like one of those and like one of the verticals that's going incredibly well is just like customer support type vertical where effectively like you're doing AI based customer support. And because this is just such a step change bigger and better than basically the human based alternatives, um uh, like this actually like is the first time that like enterprises are driven to like make a change and like to look at new vendors and to like check this out for them. But once they've committed to one of those, and like in absence of like another next change like that happening, right? They are incredibly reluctant to change anything about a system that is working for them. And if that system, like as it was deployed 2 years ago, is using Llama 2, right, it will continue using Llama 2 in the future because like the risk of changing it to anything else probably outweighs any like cost or like immediate term intelligence benefits, right? Like there's no slideshow that you could make to convince them that like, oh, like this will be so much smarter, right? Because it can do arithmetic better, right? They'll look at our completion rates look totally okay, but I'm totally happy with those, right? Right, and like oh this might be cheaper, it's like yeah, no, not really. Like, and this is the same with like this is the classical like enterprise stickiness. Like once you've gotten people used to doing it this way, and like again like a group of people will work around this because there's going to be a failure mode for Llama 2, right, that is like very specific to Llama 2, and like people are going to like develop processes, they're going to develop documentation to handle those downsides, right? There it's going to be like Llama 2 always does this mistake, so like let me fix that quickly like in this conversation, etc., etc. AI. And if you were not to change that, like they'd have to completely redo their customer support handbook, right? Because it was now designed to like utilize that model. And like it just becomes incredibly difficult. And like the most difficult thing in the world, and like is changing people's minds, right? It's also the one of the few like really important things on like everything, right? Basically, startup people try to change people's minds on like, hey, this is how I believe the future to be versus what currently the future is going to be without me, or like this is the future, it's going to happen, and I'm going to be there. This is what politicians try to do, right? Their entire job is trying to convince people to do something else, right? And like basically, this is the scourge of human existence, and it's one of the most difficult things you can do, and that's why you won't end up changing the technology. And it's like, yeah. And also, like all those things, like model changing isn't drop in, right? If you've designed a prompt to like do something, right? I can't take the same prompt to a different kind of service and expect the same performance. Like the failure modes will be different. It'll do some other stuff weirdly, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And effectively, like yeah, like for 10 years there won't be big enough of an engineering like demand to actually change this out and do this differently. Um,
But surely the difference between Llama 2 and Llama 4, or like Llama 5 or whatever, surely, even if you don't change the prompt, surely, like I agree that probably there's another prompt that is better for Llama 5 than for Llama 2. But I think the Llama 2 prompt with Llama 5 will still be much better than the Llama 2 prompt with Llama 2.
but
And yes, this will like make all of your like engineering effort to filter out the failure modes redundant, sure. So it will be a bit sad for the engineers that actually implemented this. But if you
no, I'm not
deliver
talking
better
about
service,
not talking about the engineers. I'm talking about like the customer support personnel that persists at these organizations, right? Who's like build processes around like managing those failures. So maybe, right? And like to you and for your use, absolutely, right? But an enterprise is only deploying their customer support AI if they're happy with the resolution rates, like if they're happy with like how well it is performing that one task that they're currently hiring it for. Otherwise, they're not deploying it at all, right? Or they might, no, not really. And if they're happy with the resolution rates today, they're going to be just as happy with the resolution rates in 7 years, right? Like there's no immediately like burning issue, right? It's not like oh, and like someone can show up, like you can show up to them and tell me if you change to Llama 5, your life will be better in like these 10 ways, but they're like, our life is fine, and like I'm taking a risk, and why would I take a risk, right? I'm happy
well,
with current performance, right?
they're burning money on the Llama 2 70 million model, and then you can change it to Llama 5 1B, which is like the same performance, but like, and then you can say like, so you will save money. That's
But
something they will do.
that might be something, but like my assumption is serving Llama to 7E will just like basically cost nothing.
Okay, yeah, fair,
Yeah,
fair.
I think like that's the right. I actually think the Nvidia product line announcement for 2020, like up until 2027, is quite disappointing, right? They love doing the oh, look at our flops, and it's all in FP and in
Yeah.
FP4, right? Whereas like yeah, like if I just projected performance from like we start at FP32, then we go to FP16, then to FP8, then to FP4, then to FP2, then to FP1, and infinite performance at FP0, um, then yeah, I think that's kind of like
I
cheating.
wonder
Yeah.
when they're at like FP1, how will they?
No, no, yeah, yeah. But yeah, no. Let's see. But like,
But if that's the case, if you're disappointed with that, is it mainly because okay, so you're disappointed with the hardware advancement for the coming years, but you still believe the cost is going to go down significantly. Is this algorithmic improvements, or why do you think cost will drop?
um, a few things, right? Like distillation, like algorithmic improvements, sure, right? Also quite easy to like measure and see, right? That we're definitely not hitting a wall there yet. Like look at what DeepSeek did, right? Right, incredible progress there. Like just also like very clever mechanisms. Like I loved reading it, and I was like, oh yes, that pipeline does look nice. And uh, and so like definitely not saturated there. I think like a huge amount comes from distillation, right? Where effectively like if we can do it at, a trillion parameters, right? A year later, we can most likely do it at a few billion parameters, right? And of course, like that just comes with with a huge like benefit on like compute. I think like that's sort of the second leg that you can look at this, and that we effectively just find cheaper ways to replicate those capabilities. And this has always been true, right? Continues to be true. And I think like that drives the second, and I would say like the undercounted version of this, of the entire improvement. And then if you're designing a chip just for transformer inference, you can do so much more, right? Than just like NVIDIA's chips, right? NVIDIA, the GPU is still a very general purpose kind of device. And effectively what NVIDIA has been doing with their roadmap, like to me, somewhat sadly, is just like scaling that up. Which is great for existing users that want to use the chips in exactly the way that it's currently going to be used. But like I have absolutely no doubt that there's a 10 to 100x performance improvement by just basically redesigning the architecture to fit that thing. Like yeah, like this is like what where we came from at ETH, right? And yeah, no question in my mind that like if you actually like co-design this, the software that runs the models and then the hardware
Yeah.
that actually does the execution, like there's a speed up in that order there. And if you're spending $1 billion on a training run, like actually developing a new chip for 100 million is actually pretty cheap. In comparison, right? Like from a
Yeah.
CapEx perspective, like this isn't that bad. Like for these like custom accelerator designs, like over the past like 10 years, the issue always was CapEx, right? Like Samsung couldn't justify developing a near memory and memory accelerator like for AI workloads specifically, right? Because they don't think they could recoup that capex. But now we have organizations, i.e., the AI labs, which have the capability to spend a huge amount, right? And for them, the capex like probably is quite easily recoverable. Even if you're only looking for like a 50% speed up on your chips or a 10% speed up on your chips, right? At $1 billion, that almost already justifies like the taper out cost of a new design, right? And so like this balances, in my opinion, quite well. Um, uh,
Does this mean that because some people think that okay, we might get AGI, but but it will be like super expensive to run, so will be like you have a genie with you can only ask 5 questions or whatever because it's so expensive to run. Do you believe this to be a feasible scenario, or do you think like even AGI could be distilled down to a smaller model?
Yeah, so I personally absolutely believe this. So I think that like as soon as we'll have AGI at any size, right, we'll have it at much smaller size, like in basically no time, right? Because someone out there, and like this is the classical like research direction. Someone will find a way like, oh, we actually don't need this, and we can chip out like this kind of data, right? And like we can actually like instead of doing it like this, we can do it like that, right? The first AGI run probably won't have the best hyperparameters or the best setup or like the best training data mix or the most optimized training data mix or the most, like whatever sort of like optimizations you end up doing, like you can probably find a way to like take take that information down, right? And my assumption is like as soon as you get that right, I don't think there's a lower bound on what you can like have AGI on. Like I wouldn't be surprised if like AGI ends up being possible in like a billion per RAM model. Like to me, that is totally feasible, and it will happen in almost no time after the first like AGI capable system is going on. If you want a hot take of mine, then like I think
I
AGI
do.
is a I think AGI I hate the term because I feel like it's a nonsensical discussion because it only depends on what your definition is, right? It's a
Yes.
purely definite like, and these are perfect for people who love debating, right? Because if effectively like you have definitional uncertainty, you can discuss and debate ad infinitum, and but if you do, right, and that's why like you can reasonably set that definition in a way where like GPT 3.5, GPT 4 is AGI, right? Where it's like
Definitely.
on like an if we like basically take like an average intelligence surface level where it's like, oh, like this is where the human scores on all of these like different kinds of things, and this is where GPT 4 scores, right? Then sure, there's like weird stuff where like GPT 4 is like worse than a human, right? On that task, but like if you take the average of that surface, right, like, there's no one who knows as much about history, code, right, like some weird medical, biological facts, and like all of Wikipedia, right? Like that person does not exist, right? And like depending on how you set your definition of an average person, right, being able to write coherent English sentence is already outside of the capabilities of most people, right? And like it purely depends on like how do you actually define it. And like a lot of the AGI definitions are like, oh, like there is no task where a human is better on average than the AI. And I'm like, that really
Yeah,
sounds like super intelligence to me, right? That sounds like it's better than a human and not the same as a human, right?
yeah,
And yeah, like I think like yeah, I think you could reasonably argue GPT 3.5 is AGI, right? And you can reasonably argue that GPT 10 is not, right? And it's really difficult to like draw that line and actually have any sort of certainty on yeah,
yeah.
this is the case or this is not the case.
Yeah,
Uh,
I completely agree. Like we use AGI as some kind of point in history that we want to anchor specific events to. Like when do we get AGI, and then but I think it's like there's other points you can anchor to that are like more interesting. I think like for example, recursive self-improvement is like an anchor like that. It's not AGI. Like you could get recursive self-improvement, I guess, without AGI, and that might be,
or it
or
could
it might
be
be far beyond AGI depending on your definition.
the average person does not regularly contribute to, model training improvements, right?
Yeah, but at least it's like a concrete thing. Like
Yeah,
when models can start create other models. I think that's like a more interesting milestone or like thing you can
yeah,
anchor in.
yeah.
So okay, so I know we talked a bit about offline that you don't agree with, or I don't think you agree with the Tyler Cowen's take on like what all of this like AI future would mean for the GDP and the economy. But now in our conversation, I feel like you're saying a lot of things that are very similar to what he's saying. Like he's saying that yes, AI will be a super big thing long term, but in the short term, there's like bottlenecks with humans and all of this. This is basically his take. And then his take is like, and intelligence is not the return on the intelligence is not that good, basically.
Yeah.
But and then he says like, okay, this means that we will probably have like 0.5% growth or something like that to GDP because of AGI. What is yeah? What do you agree with here, and what do you don't agree with?
I think the reason why you didn't elicit those opinions out of me is because you asked on a too short of a timeline. So I think like over 2 years, the impact will be zilch. It will be basically immeasurable.
Yeah,
Even if tomorrow OpenAI comes out and like by our definition of AGI, we have AGI, right, et cetera, et cetera. I actually believe the like if tomorrow you were able to access AGI through an API, right, it would still take quite a while until that actually like somehow like changes really anything. And um, but I don't agree with like Tyler Cohn's take where like and I think his take basically distills down to intelligence is only one of the inputs in the economy, right? And
yeah,
for software companies, intelligence is almost 100% of the input, right? But for most, real businesses, it's like 20% input is intelligence. And like everything else is the other constraints. Like, oh, you need to manufacture what you're doing, right? You need to sell, like somehow distribute what you're doing. You need to somehow market what you're doing. And like marketing, maybe engineering, maybe intelligence, right? Like, but there's just like other constraints on your business. But and like I think and in the past, like we've kind of seen what this can do, right? So Microsoft was a fundamentally better business than all the other businesses that were created before it because Microsoft had no marginal cost, right? So effectively, creating an extra copy of Windows is free. And while like almost all other companies selling all other goods had a non-zero marginal cost, Microsoft definitely did still have. Microsoft had a zero marginal cost or close to zero marginal cost. And that just basically means they could like strike one item from their balance sheet and they became a better business like as a whole because of it. And like his argument is basically like, oh, like if you strike intelligence is one of those lines, right? That actually doesn't make that much of a difference, right? But intelligence is a different good than like, oh, marginal cost, right? For your product because you can basically apply intelligence to any sort of problem that you have and make that problem smaller, right? And like one example like for this is lithium ion batteries, right? So it used to be this like whole thing where like, oh, the lithium ion batteries are using cobalt and they're using large amounts of cobalt. Like A, that's coming from the Congo, which isn't a great place to source your materials from, and B, it's really expensive and there isn't that much of it. Like, so can we even like completely electrify our roads? But what effectively happened was intelligence was applied to the problem, and we found a uh, and uh, and we found a battery chemistry, lithium iron phosphate, right? That does not need cobalt, right? And effectively you completely got rid of that requirement that was previously a huge constraint on our business, right? Um, and like you could argue the same thing happened to Netflix, right? So like Netflix could have um, Netflix basically like they could have spent a lot of money on like how can we mail stuff faster? How can we make sure that the CDs that we mail don't break as often or like don't have as many issues, et cetera, et cetera. But like they applied intelligence to the problem and they found a solution that completely got rid of that requirement and they just like sent it over the internet, right? And effectively, like my assumption is that if you apply like a team of PhDs for 10 years, maybe PhDs is the wrong metric here because PhDs over 10 years rarely do much, but like I think the example still stands where effectively like you can apply intelligence to any of these other constraints that the business has and like severely diminish them. And while this isn't like a first order effect of having basically free and abundant intelligence, it's definitely a second order effect. And like that's where I would like assume, like real growth to actually end up showing up where it's like, oh, like we can just like basically make every problem smaller, do optimize everything to an insane degree, like get rid of all the requirements that can be gotten rid of, right? And then engineer everything that we do still have, like to an insane degree, right? Like to me, like that's where you'll actually end up seeing the effects. But again, like that's a split timeline, right? Like we can, if we had tomorrow had a system that can write the perfect marketing message for your sort of product, right? Then maybe marketing costs go down to zero, right? That's kind of good and makes your business better, but like it's still fundamentally the same business. But if you then can start applying intelligence to any other problem that you end up encountering, that's when you really like get the outsized benefit.
And other bottlenecks, like the ones we talked about before, that there are actually people with the decision. Those are going to, like, is that not going to be a bottleneck in 5 years, or what is the?
So yeah, changing people is again like the most difficult problem humanity has ever had, right? And like there's still no
Yeah,
solved way to like change people's opinions at scale and at low cost. Like I think that's a good thing, right? Otherwise democracy wouldn't work. But it's definitely like an incredibly persistent problem. And like a lot of the slowdown will of course also come from that. Like, oh, you're
yeah.
used to doing it some way, right? And like how do you convince people to do it a different way? Or like to hold a different set of opinions. I think like that's the second set of the slowdown. These usually aren't that large though in I think like these are much more difficult to change in private individuals than they are in business, right? Like private individuals or for that matter academia. Like getting a like 55-year-old professor to change their mind on something they hold fundamentally to be true is impossible. Right? Like yeah, science advances one death at a time, right? I think like that's more or less the pace. And but for companies, right, like if I'm currently using material Y, right, and now I can use material X, and it's just like better in every way, right? There's huge pressures just like from the financial perspective to actually make that change, right? And if those pressures are pronounced enough, like you can like have some guarantees that the economy will fall in line quicker than like the
Hmm.
general population. But yeah.
Okay. Last question. So I always end on this question because I love it so much. So assume we have AI, AGI, whatever the definition is, or some utopia where misalignment didn't go wrong, and you have abundance of resources, everything, and this is like assume it's like 2035, 10 years ago, away, and then you look back from this point. You look back at the previous 10 years, so from now until 2035. What are you most proud of? What did you do during these years that you look back on and with the most pride?
So this is a very difficult question, simply because I don't know if the things that I take pride in 10 years will still be the things that I take pride in today. So like assuming my values haven't really changed that much in that direction.
Oh no, no, I have to change my favorite question. Turns out it's a bad one.
Um, no, I think the yeah, for uh like most people currently take pride in like their skills and what they're able to do, right? Because like that's usually associated with with strength, right? I feel like we derive like our sense of being quite directly from our capabilities to do. And like in a world where effectively like any capability is commodified, right? I would argue that like the things that I take pride in would most likely change quite drastically, right? And like think like probably um the actual true answer is going to be family if you ask me in 10 years. But today, no, like today, I would love my contribution. And like, I think my contribution and the thing I'll be most proud of is like actually making this somehow happen and impactful and actually like having it reach every part of the world. Right? To me, mentally, this is like the plow for sustenance farming, where effectively like, hey, we're currently going from a world where everyone has to like tend to the fields effectively to make sustenance work, right? And to basically mean that you're fed. With the plow and with like, industrialized agriculture, that could mean that 3% of the world's population can provide the food for the rest, right? Um, and like I believe that to be an incredibly great future. Like the Industrial Revolution is the reason why you don't no longer work 7 days a week, but five. Um, and I don't know if like vacationing will be my version of a utopia, but like in general, like giving people the agency to no longer have to tend to the fields if they don't want to, is I think like one of the greatest unlocks, right? And they think like looking back at this, we'll see it as like holy shit, we would never want to go back to the Middle Ages, right? That sounds horrible, right? That sounds absolutely awful. Like why? And like today, like the people who didn't want the plow, right, or who didn't want enlightenment, etc., etc. Well, but that was a majority of people. Like in some point in time, like looking backwards, we believe them to be wrong, right? And I think we'll more or less see it this way. I think like that's the kind of thing. So yeah, having helped actually like produce that future.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of ending it. Thank you so much for talking to me
Yeah.
today, and hope you get to be a part of that. I bet you will.
I hope so. I hope so. What's your answer? Have you ever answered that question
I haven't.
on the podcast?
Uh,
You should. I mean, you've had the most time to think about it, so
yeah, probably.
and consider all the
Yeah.
answers.
So yeah, I think my answer is that I think all of what you said is probably true, and I also want to be a part of it. I see some ways of this going pretty bad. So
And
basically,
the
like
question was premised on it being a utopia, right?
yes, I know, but I think when we live in a utopia, that's because some people worked really hard for it to be a utopia and not be like the AI doom scenarios that some people think. And I think they are not that implausible. And I do think that if we end up in a utopia, it was because someone worked really hard for it. Because I think the default could probably be there's a significant chance at least that the default will not lead to the utopia. So if we end up in the utopia, that's because someone stopped bad stuff from happening. And if I was a part of that, stopping bad stuff from happening, I would be very proud.
And okay, I think that's a good answer. One follow-up
Thank you.
question: the bad stuff from happening in your mind, is that like a first order effect of like basically AGI being like the way to make the most paper clips is to have no humans, right? Or is that downstream of effectively like AI lets you own labor, right? In a
No,
way
I
that
think
like basically has like not been in a reality for 150 years, at least in the United States. Going back to basically owning labor in this case will mean that you can just have an incredible accumulation of wealth and an accumulation of benefit to like a very, very small share of the population.
I worry more about the first one. I think that the second one, okay, I shouldn't make big claims here, but I don't think the second one is that bad. Probably because I think we have enough altruistic people that in a world where we have a lot of trillionaires, some of them will implement some kind of like private UBI or something. So I think
Oof.
there might be.
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. Like I'm unsure if I would buy into the future where the world's benefit is like at the benevolence of some. I mean, that's quite literally a king, right?
Well, it doesn't need to be one. It could be.
I could be fine, and then it's much
And
better.
also, like importantly, also there will be a lot of trillionaires, and only some of them will be part of the private UBI. However, they will not be almighty themselves because there's like a lot of trillionaires. I mean, I'm not completely sure about this, but I think the other scenario of indirect badness, like the AIs just doesn't care about us that much and they are super powerful. I think that one is a bigger worry. And then I also worry about stuff like maybe we have TikTok plus 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 where everyone just like has a VR headset all day, and then it's some kind of like experience machine where you just optimize for experiences, and you lose what is like important.
I was at a recommender system conference a year ago, like totally by chance. I saw this pop up on my feed. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go. And the talk that like really stuck in my mind was from one of the Instagram people, where they were effectively benchmarking recommender systems, their classical approaches versus transformer-based approaches, right? And like back early, like there's like early 2024, I guess, something like on that order. They were like, for the first time, like transformer-based approaches were like outpacing their classical like deep learning approaches. Um, and like his comment was like, yeah, like this is great, right? Because currently we're like data limited in our accuracy, right? And now with transformers we're compute limited, and compute limitation is much easier to overcome because we have a very big credit card. And
Yeah.
and like I personally don't really, right. And before that, like improvement was kind of constant, right? Because it basically depended on like new data entering the system, and a more or less constant amount of data enters the system on their end. Also, like the amount of data is absolutely crazy, right? Like he phrased it in tokens, although I don't think tokens is actually how they measure it on the input side. But he said basically like they collect trillions of tokens a day,
Oh
whereas like
wow.
GPT-4 is trained on trillions of tokens total. But yeah, like insane amounts of data, but like basically really limited in the way that they could like deploy that. And like yeah, if this actually now correlates with compute, right, and Meta can just like buy a bigger cluster, and effectively the algorithm gets twice as good, and then they can buy an even better cluster and it gets twice as good again. I actually think that's an insanely scary future, and I don't think we've really priced that in.
Hmm.
Uh,
Oh, that's insane. Yeah, because people say like, oh, we run out of the internet, but then you get like the internet is like 30 trillion tokens or something like that. That you get within a month. You have you have another internet. The
yeah,
the quality of that might be lower though. Do,
yeah,
do you
yeah.
worry
There's
about the scenarios of some kind of like the classical philosophical experiment of like if you had an experience machine where you just could just like set on a headset and then you just experience everything to the ultimate, and then it's like would you do this or not? Like it would be ultimate joy, but it would be a very shallow experience.
I
Do
I
you worry
think what
about
it would
this?
um so yes and no, right? I think like, to some degree we've already created these, right? And I think like that's a consequence of these like late stage incentive systems. So it's like, time spent is how you make money, right? And like the best way to spend time is basically just like drip feed content this way, right? And effectively like we're in a 20-year engineering effort to basically get you to spend as much time as you can on these systems, right? Um, and and so I think we're actually pretty close. Like my underlying hope or belief would be that like with every new technology wave, right, effectively the existing tech stack gets wiped, and it usually gets wiped quite conclusively, and that usually realigns incentives to be much closer to consumer preference, right? Because like in a late stage sort of environment, you can stray arbitrarily far from consumer preference because you already have all of that market power. But if it's basically like it gets rejiggled and you now have to fight for people, you end up building products that are much, much better for them. And I think we could see like going back to this like ideal of tech being a tool, right? And you use it to, do something, and back from like you're a tool for technology to make more ad revenue, right? Like that's the current version. And I think like new technology waves have this great kind of like ability to actually do that and push that forward. To me, this is still cyclical. Like I do subscribe to the opinion that AI might be the last technology wave, in which like the last technology wave period, right? Because every other technology wave will effectively happen at an implementation level where we don't really understand, right? Where it's like, a chip will get tapered out. We don't really know what it does, right? But effectively, it does what the AI cares about. The AI writes the software that runs on the chip, right? And then basically it produces some sort of benefit that we care about, right? And like the next generations of technology will just like might just be so far abstracted, and like the next big technology waves might just be so far from like human innovation and human push that it might be the last like technology wave that changes the like changes the balances of power. And in that world, I would absolutely worry about the experience machine, right? But before
Mm.
that, like I just feel like the cycle is too strong, and basically, like yeah, you have this like periodical reassessment of consumer preferences and then realignment with consumer preferences. Like ChatGPT is much more aligned with consumer preference than Google, right? Um,
Yes. Yeah.
so like, and right, so like, I'm quite convinced that the current wave of AI is quite closely aligned with that like with that historical pattern. But yeah, would you put on the experience machine?
I would no. I mean no is the answer that everyone wants to say, right? And
Yeah,
then and
yeah. It's
then you
like
have
I am so intellectual. I am above the pleasures of the flesh.
yeah.
Blah blah blah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I read this blog post the other day. It was I forgot the author, but like it was super interesting. It was about I think this went kind of viral on Twitter, so people might recognize it. But it was basically there's a painting from an artist, but he died while painting it, or like he was sick with AIDS, and he died when the painting was just halfway painted, and like the painting in its half painted state is so powerful. Like you look at it and you like and then he died. Like that is just like it hurts your heart. You
Mm-hmm.
see like death. You see death in how death actually affects the world, and that makes this painting so powerful. And then and then in a world with AI where you don't have death, like or you do have death, but like there's no disease. AIDS is not a thing with technology. Then you wouldn't have paintings like this that were half painted. And then the point of the blog post is like, but this is worth it, of course. Like it's of course we would want to save this person from dying if we could, even though
We
this would
probably
make
could already today, right?
yeah.
Huh?
This was
Uh-huh.
in the 80s, I think, or something. But
Yeah,
like
89.
so of course we would want to save him if we could. But then the world would be much more shallow because then we wouldn't have like great art like this. I know it's one example, but I think it's like it's interesting as one data point of how like a shallow world with more joy is actually more shallow. But then again, of course, I want to save him, and I think this is like kind of the parallel to the experience machine. Would you
So
would you do it even though it's more shallow?
I think
Probably
um,
yes.
I think there's like these two competing thoughts I hold in my head, right? Both of which I believe to be true, but somehow like by each other. Like there's always this like picture of like, oh, the greatest artists are like, these troubled personalities come from deep trauma, right? Like experiences. Like this is the most extreme version of that, right? Like you're dying while you're painting, right? Like it doesn't really get much more traumatic than that. But at the same time, all the literature shows that people do their best work when they feel some security, when they feel some, like when they feel at home in a role, right? Like that's when they perform best, right? Like especially like in the, management literature kind of sense, right? And like that's when they produce the most work. And like I personally believe both of this to be true. Like I have not seen a single team that is ruled through fear and ruled through intimidation and ruled through trauma, right? That like really ends up outperforming, right? And usually the people that like, try to lift the entire team actually push the furthest and like are most successful as a team. And so like I personally I'm like I hold these two things, right? And I know one to be true and I know the other to be true. And it might just be that there's like different things matter in the artistic professions than like the non-artistic professions. And that like the mastery is a different kind of mastery, the problems are different kinds of problems, right? Um, et cetera, et cetera. But like I personally don't believe um, that experience, right, necessarily means that what a future humanity could produce would be more shallow, right? Some of the greatest artists that we now look to of like in Renaissance times, right, were incredibly well off, right? Almost all of them were like they were standing there, you're not painting painting a ceiling in a palazzo straight off the street, right? Like these were usually like incredibly well educated, incredibly rich people who, for that time, had any comfort that was conceivable to have, and yet still they produced greatness this way. Or like what we would now see as greatness. I think maybe also, but yeah, maybe I think we've also shifted on what we personally believe to be art, right? Like post-war contemporary art is, I would say, much more somber, much more, I think like the motifs of like death and the motifs of like loss and the motifs of like mental illness are much, much stronger, right? And while like that kind of art might have existed in the past, it never was mainstream, and now it's definitely mainstream. So I think like that has also shaped what we like expect
Mm.
art to kind of be.
Interesting. Yeah.
And like that, it might be that like in 50 years people why should I put this grim dark painting on my wall when instead I could have this like beautiful impressionistic landscape. And I don't like beautiful impressionistic landscapes personally, right? But like I can totally see someone in 50 years having totally 180 on that again. And yeah, like yeah.
So would you
Huh?
put on the experience machine?
Would I put on the experience machine? So um I don't actually think the experience machine would be that successful in the medium to long term. Um, because like I think if you can, because what humans are incredibly good at is basically growing accustomed to what they currently have and basically no longer valuing it at
Yeah, but
all,
I think the
right?
premise is that it will recognize this and optimize for this, and then give you as much pain as you need to get
To love
the
it.
pleasure.
Because like otherwise it's like like how often have you appreciated running water in your home? Basically never. And like it's kind of like we immediately get used to everything that's nice, right? And basically no longer value it at all, right? Like to me, like there's definitely a subset of the population that would wear that helmet, right? And like I think the closest parallel I have is like what this experience machine would effectively do is like it would just like exploit your brain chemistry into like you being happy, right? Like that's the mechanism I personally believe the experience machine to exploit. And there's like, oh, like it'll just like make sure they can maximally extract all serotonin, dopamine, or whatever. I'm not that into that, but like and it would just like do that incredibly well. But my assumption is we just like kind of like and but my closest parallel in real life is like taking fentanyl, right? Which like some subset of the population does, as we, having moved to San Francisco have learned, but it's still an unappealing proposition to a majority, right? Where like in theory, like you could take fentanyl, you could be incredibly happy for a short period of time, and as long as you continue taking it, you would be as happy as like probably both of us will never be in our lives. And like but still like we kind of decide not to do it, right? And so like I should think weirdly enough, right, you would assume that most people do, but I would argue like you already have a pretty close parallel to this, and very few people actually like go down that route and basically like chase that down religiously.
Yeah, although I think like the premise of the there are downsides of fentanyl, obviously, and I think the premise of the question is that you can get the upsides of fentanyl
This is so
without.
yeah, but like I would argue there is no such thing as without the downsides. Like if you're wearing that experience
Yeah,
helmet all day long, like you're gonna be fat, right? Like there's no question about it. Like unless there's like even in the future where you also have an Ozempic drip like into your
yeah,
body from like another sort of
yeah.
cable, it's not gonna be great, right? And like there's definitely going to be some sort of downside, right?
Mm.
Like my assumption is, yeah. My assumption is like we'd grow accustomed to it and then we'd be like, I don't really care for that anymore. What I do think that will like fundamentally change is like if there's like a helmet you can put on and get all the hedonism in the world that you want, right? And then people like start rejecting hedonism because they've basically saturated on hedonism. I totally see that like fundamentally changing what we value in society, right?
Yeah.
Because like hedonistic ideals, like definitely exist, right? Even like the most hardworking people definitely are hedonistic, like Jeff Bezos is an example, right? So like yeah, I think like that's the
Mm.
that would be my take. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, let me try to do the intro a second time.
Sure.
I love that you stopped me last time. This
Yeah.
was great. Great last conversation. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the pod, Max. It was lovely to talk to you, and yeah, see you around.
Thank you so much.
Bye.